I'm Andy Kasner, Research Assistant Professor and Extension Wildlife Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Research. I'm pleased to share an overview of the educational program that I developed during my participation in the Prairie Project's Climate Hub Education and Outreach Cohort 2. My program is intended for a variety of audiences, including private landowners who wish to learn more about prescribed fire and grazing as tools for management of wildlife habitat, and also for other public audiences, such as birders who wish to learn more about the value of working lands and for wildlife and bird conservation. Each program begins with an overview of the differences between several different types of fire on working lands and a description of three categories of habitat for upland game birds. Participants are offered the opportunity to provide a definition or a list of the three habitat categories. Often, they generally list food, water, and shelter, but we end up defining these habitat categories relative to nesting, brooding, and escape cover during the life cycle of upland game birds. I start with a discussion about the types of habitat fragmentation and the effects of climate change, poor grazing management, and fire suppression on shrub encroachment into grassland and savanna ecosystems. I then talk briefly about how fragmentation can also be defined as the loss or disruption of natural disturbances, such as periodic fire and grazing. And then finally, that there are many species whose ecology and habitat associations are directly related to historical natural disturbance regimes on the prairie, especially fire and grazing. I use this map on historic fire return intervals, published by Guyette and others, to emphasize the idea that naturally and regularly occurring fires created and maintained ecosystems that wildlife depend on in North America, but that these fire frequencies have been severely altered by human intervention in recent history. I then talk through a suite of example species and the way in which fire and grazing can be used to create or maintain habitat for major life cycle needs of birds. I discuss the importance of fire for habitat management for species of conservation concern, such as the black-capped vireo, the ways in which improper management of grazing or fire can lead to habitat loss for species such as this, and we talk about how some grassland birds need more intensive or frequent disturbance for more open grassland habitats, while others need maybe a longer fire interval or a different timing or season for fire to occur to maintain more of a shrubland or savanna type habitat, or even a forest with a largely herbaceous understory like you might see managed for wild turkey in the southeastern U.S. I use examples of multiple species, and I also use photos to provide examples of quality habitat and poor habitat, such as the ones you see here for bobwhite, and use similar examples for some other species later on. So I talk about or focus on the timing of fire or grazing and how they can be used to create habitat for different stages of the breeding season. So for example, how grazing or fire or a combination of the two can be used to provide habitat or nesting cover for quail with nests with eggs versus brooding cover for quail with chicks that need to be able to travel around the landscape and eat a protein-rich diet of insects and other foods, and how they also need escape cover, places to hide from predators. And we talk about the same concept as it applies to wild turkey and other species. So the same thing would apply for wild turkey management and how their habitat needs are related to fire and grazing. Um, and so I go through an example of this for wild turkey, including nesting cover, and how that might be different from brood rearing cover, raising chicks, where those chicks need to be able to move through the landscape and find appropriate food. And then finally, we talk for a little while about how the timing of prescribed fire, or grazing for that matter, can affect habitat outcomes. And so when to burn to accomplish certain habitat objectives. I use this satellite view or Google Earth image, which is from our Sonora research station owned by Texas A&M AgriLife Research. And I asked the class to identify differences between the 6 patches that are shown here and why they might differ. And so we get into a discussion of those things, but ultimately we talk about how of these 6 rectangles, 2 of them are controls, which are unburned plots. 2 of them are burned on a regular fire interval in the winter, and 2 of them are burned on a regular fire interval in the summer, and how this can create different habitat conditions in those burn units. I then go through some question slides after we've talked about each of these species and their habitat needs and how we might manage habitat using grazing or fire as tools. I then go through a series of pictures and ask the participants to tell me which photographs represent good or bad habitat for that species. And so I do this for black-capped vireo, for Rio Grande turkey in this case. And in this specific example, I asked them also which of these might represent good nesting habitat versus good roosting habitat or good brood rearing habitat, or none of the above. Same for bob whites. And then finally, I get into some more details. This talk can be tailored to last anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour long. And depending on the audience and the length goals, we can also add information such as this about how to conduct more scientific bird surveys or point counts. I referenced this Landowner's Guide to Conducting a Bird Survey. How we also can use other things like mark recapture to get population estimates. This is using the example of a banding study that we've done in the past. Just to give the participants an idea of how not only can we manage habitat, but how we can monitor bird populations in a scientific way to demonstrate successful conservation of those species or successful habitat outcomes. I also wrap up with some concluding thoughts about why this is important from an economic standpoint, from a landowner standpoint, and from a public standpoint. And one example I use about that is the impact of birding economically in Texas. Finally, I share some resources with the class, with the participants that might be useful to them and their time. And for those of you who are considering a program like this, these resources are available in my folder. And then I finally leave some time for participants and students to ask questions. And then we revisit. So I forgot to mention this earlier, but at the beginning, we asked the participants to do a survey to get a measure of their knowledge of these different kinds of fire and habitat management and climate and how it affects shrub encroachment on the prairie. And then we follow up with a post-survey that again seeks to quantify something about their knowledge and the knowledge gained through this educational program. We revisit those definitions that we started with to kind of review and reiterate the importance of the things we've talked about for the program. Activities that can be included with this, if this is simply classroom based, Google Earth imagery for the example I use, the Sonora Research Station, or some other site familiar to the instructor, can be used to guide students through a discussion of habitat differences related to fire or grazing. There also can be some assigned reading for discussion. I use this in an undergraduate class, for example. And in the field, we can use things like the Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guide, or simply send the class out to identify differences in habitat that they think might be related to fire or grazing or somehow relate to birds. And so for one example, I have a group of birders go out and they just visit different pastures on a ranch list the birds that they see there, and then when we come back, we talk about how those pastures are different because of the timing or history of fire on that landscape and how that might inform the bird communities that they see.